Okay. Okay. I'm just enjoying sitting. Sitting is a beautiful thing. When you have a job where you stand literally the whole time for 5 to 8 hours all at once, and then you leave, and then you run for 4 miles, and then you come home, and then you stand in a shower for an hour. But now I am sitting. It's so nice. I'm also really sleepy. I barely slept last night. Don't know what was going on. Don't know why. It's as if I had caffeine or something, but I didn't. So, I don't know what was going on. But anyway, hello fellow witches and wizards. My name is PhoenixGinny, and welcome to the stream. Welcome back to Let's Read my webcam. I need a new webcam. Anyway, if you couldn't tell already, I need a new webcam. Welcome back to Storytime Saturdays. This is Storytime Saturday number 34, and we're reading chapters 9 and 10 from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling. Things are about to get serious up in here. Yeah. So, I apologize for the low energy, but it's been a long one. Oh, I don't want to talk about it. Okay. Please feel free to talk in the chat during my reading, because this is a discussion. It's not just me talking at you. You're free to join the discussion, and if you're watching this and it's no longer live, you're still free to join the discussion. Just leave your comments and I will respond to them. And if you like the stream, please click the like button and become a subscriber if you're not subscribed, and turn on notifications so you could be notified the next time I upload, the next time I go live. I was supposed to upload my project this week, this big project I've been working on since... I'm sorry. My webcam is really gross. I don't know what's going on. It's bothering me. Oh, I don't have a stand for it. I would show you what my webcam looks like, but I can't because I'd have to use my webcam to show you what my webcam looks like. It's not on a permanent stand or anything. It literally just sits on my monitor because the genius who created this device didn't give me a way to clamp it to my monitor or anything. I don't know. I don't understand. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, my big Harry Potter... Oh, shoot. I just ruined... Well, I didn't ruin it. I was trying not to spoil what the project was. Surprise, surprise, it's Harry Potter related. Although, I guess that's not really a spoiler, because you could probably assume that. But I've been working on this project for months, and I have it done, and so I uploaded it to YouTube, I attempted to upload it, and I ran into copyright issues, which I thought there would be issues, but I didn't think the issue would be so bad that I couldn't post the video. I thought it would be like what it usually says, like, we can't monetize the video. It's like, well, that's fine, because you can't monetize any of my videos because I'm not a YouTube partner, so I don't care. I thought it would be something like that, but no, they're just, like, angry, like, red, like, we can't show this video at all unless you cut this bit out. Okay, so I have to cut about 6 minutes of footage out, which is, in the grand scheme of the whole video, isn't that big of a deal, but it's a really precious 6 minutes. And it makes me a little sad. But what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go into my old footage. I'm going to have to edit it out. And I'm going to insert a video of myself explaining why the clip is cut and what you miss. It's not that big of a deal. I'm a tad heartbroken, but the owner of said material has every... Ew. Sorry, I think there's a spider in my webcam. Ew, get off. Oh, it's a dead spider. Sorry. That was really distracting. I try to look directly at my webcam when I talk to you because I want you to feel like I'm talking to you and not myself. Because if I were talking while looking at myself, it looks like I'm talking to myself. But no, I'm talking to you. And I can see my webcam. And for whatever reason, it's really gross. I don't know what's going on. Sorry. Anyway, what was I saying? Upload, yes. Yeah, I'm gonna have to tweak it a little bit. It's not gonna take that long. It's not gonna be that hard. And hopefully I'll be able to upload it and share it with you guys next week. Live streams. I will be live streaming again next weekend, most probably. Friday and Saturday. I've been doing really well being regular for the past few weeks. So Friday I'll be playing more A Plague's Tale. We'll be doing the second to last section, chapters. It's probably going to be chapters. I say probably because I usually do 4 chapters at a time. But I might actually do 5 chapters for the next part because there's one chapter that's really short. So I'll be doing chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, probably chapters 9 through 13, possibly. Yeah, and then we'll be almost done. There's 17 chapters in the game, and I'll finish it the week after. And then we can start the new one, because the new one will be out by then. And then reading more Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, chapters 11 and 12. If you want to know what time I'm going to be streaming, follow me on Twitter, linked in the description. Also in the description is my Patreon. If you'd like to support me as a content creator, you can do it there. Follow the link and it'll tell you how to do it. It's just $5 a month to become a subscriber or a patron or whatever they call it. And if you do choose to subscribe, you get perks such as being able to read all my content that's on there, because I'm a writer and I post short stories and poetry and essays and what have you, and you can read all of them on there. However, if you can't afford to become a patron, you can read some stuff on there because some of it is totally free. So follow the link and check out what I have on there. This month I just released the prologue for my Harry Potter fanfiction, and that is free, of course, because it's fanfiction, so check it out there. I also have a TikTok and an Instagram. Both are linked in the description, and I leave content on there as well, so check that out. Okay, now we will... I always think I'm far into the book. I'm not. I'm still at the beginning. We're going to be reading chapters 9 and 10 today. Chapter 9. It's gonna be a doozy. It's a novel. This chapter is a novel. I'm gonna lose my voice. Oh my goodness. And this chapter is really dark and really hard to read too. When I first read this chapter as a kid, I was pretty horrified. Like so bad that I had to put the book down. I was feeling nauseous. It made me not feel great. But as an adult, I can handle it a little better. But it is a hard read for sure. So first I will do a recap, as I always do, of chapter 7 and 8, the chapters we read last time. Chapter 7 was Bagman and Crouch. Okay, so they landed at the campsite at the... I was supposed to say Triwizard Tournament. No, at the Quidditch World Cup. They set up a tent the Muggle way. They explore the campsite and they find other witches and wizards and how they live and how they do camping. They ran into some friends. They met some ministry folks, and then Ludo Bagman came by, and talked about Bertha Jorkins and how she's still missing. Barty Crouch comes by. They don't have a particularly interesting conversation. They kind of hint at the Triwizard Tournament, I'm pretty sure. And then the Quirrell Cup, Chapter 8. They meet Winky the House Elf, who is saving her master a seat. Wink, wonk, wink, wonk. We run into the Malfoys because they're sharing a box. Blah. Blah. And then we see, the Quirrell Cup. I make it sound like so, blah, blah, boring. Sorry, I'm really tired. It's not boring. It's the Quirrell Cup. What else can I say about it? You missed it, unless you've read it before. They have lots of fun with the leprechauns and the Vila battling it out. Crumb gets the snitch, but Ireland wins because they have more points. And then the match's done. Yep, and that's where we are. We're at Chapter 9. They're headed back to the camp. So that's what we're reading now. All right, Chapter 9, The Dark Mark. "Don't tell your mother you've been gambling," Mr. Weasley implored Fred and George as they all made their way slowly down the purple-carpeted stairs. "Don't worry, Dad," said Fred gleefully. "We've got big plans for this money. We don't want it confiscated." Mr. Weasley looked for a moment as though he was going to ask what these big plans were, but seemed to decide upon reflection that he didn't want to know. They were soon caught up in the crowds now flooding out of the stadium and back to their campsites. Roush's singing was borne toward them on the night air as they retraced their steps along the lantern-lit path, and leprechauns kept shooting over their heads, cackling and waving their lanterns. When they finally reached the tents, nobody felt like sleeping at all, and given the level of noise around them, Mr. Weasley agreed that they could all have one last cup of cocoa together before turning in. They were soon arguing enjoyably about the match. Mr. Weasley got drawn into a disagreement about cobbing with Charlie, and it was only when Ginny fell asleep right at the tiny table and spilled hot chocolate all over the floor that Mr. Weasley called a halt to the verbal replays and insisted that everyone go to bed. Hermione and Ginny went into the next tent, and Harry and the rest of the Weasleys changed into pajamas and clambered into their bunks. From the other side of the campsite, they could still hear much singing and the odd echoing bang. "Oh, I am glad I'm not on duty," muttered Mr. Weasley sleepily. "I wouldn't fancy having to go and tell the Irish they've got to stop celebrating." Harry, who was on a top bunk above Ron, lay staring up at the canvas ceiling of the tent, watching the glow of an occasional leprechaun lantern flying overhead and picturing again some of Crumb's more spectacular moves. He was itching to get back on his own firebolt and try out the Wronski feint. Somehow Oliver Wood had never managed to convey, with all his wriggling diagrams, what that move was supposed to look like. Harry saw himself in robes that had his name on the back, and imagined the sensation of hearing 100,000-strong crowd roar as Ludo Bagman's voice echoed throughout the stadium, "I give you Potter!" Harry never knew whether or not he had actually dropped off to sleep. His fantasies of flying like Crumb might well have slipped into actual dreams. All he knew was that, quite suddenly, Mr. Weasley was shouting, "Get up! Ron! Harry! Come on now, get up! This is urgent!" Harry sat up quickly, and the top of his head hit canvas. "'S matter?" he said. Dimly he could tell that something was wrong. The noises in the campsite had changed. The singing had stopped. He could hear screams and the sound of people running. He slipped down from the bunk and reached for his clothes, but Mr. Weasley, who had pulled on his jeans over his own pajamas, said, "No time, Harry. Just grab a jacket and get outside. Quickly." Harry did as he was told and hurried out of the tent, Ron at his heels. By the light of the few fires that were still burning, he could see people running away into the woods, fleeing something that was moving across the field toward them. Something that was emitting odd flashes of light and noises like gunfire. Loud jeering, roars of laughter, and drunken yells were drifting toward them. Then came a burst of strong green light, which illuminated the scene. A crowd of wizards, tightly packed and moving together, with wands pointing straight upward, was marching slowly across the field. Harry squinted at them. They didn't seem to have faces. Then he realized that their heads were hooded and their faces masked. High above them, floating along in midair, 4 struggling figures were being contorted into grotesque shapes. It was as though the masked wizards on the ground were puppeteers, and the people above them were marionettes, operated by invisible strings that rose from the wands into the air. 2 of the figures were very small. Oh, God. More wizards were joining the marching group, laughing and pointing up at the floating bodies. Tents crumpled and fell as the marching crowd swelled. Once or twice Harry saw one of the marchers blast a tent out of his way with his wand. Several caught fire. The screaming grew louder. The floating people were suddenly illuminated as they passed over a burning tent, and Harry recognized one of them, Mr. Roberts, the campsite manager. The other 3 looked as though they might be his wife and children. One of the marchers below flipped Mrs. Roberts upside down with his wand. Her nightdress fell down to reveal voluminous drawers, and she struggled to cover herself up as the crowd below her screeched and hooted with glee. Yeah, this part made me really sick. "That's sick," Ron muttered, watching the smallest Muggle child, who had begun to spin like a top 60 feet above the ground, his head flopping limply from side to side. "That is really sick." Hermione and Ginny came hurrying toward them, pulling coats over their nightdresses, with Mr. Weasley right behind them. At the same moment, Bill, Charlie, and Percy emerged from the boys' tent, fully dressed, with their sleeves rolled up and their wands out. Yeah, I wish that could be me. I'm like, are we going to do something? Is anybody going to stop them? "We're going to help the ministry," Mr. Weasley shouted over all the noise, rolling up his own sleeves. "You lot, get into the woods and stick together. I'll come and fetch you when we've sorted this out." Bill, Charlie, and Percy were already sprinting away toward the oncoming marchers. Mr. Weasley tore after them. Ministry wizards were dashing from every direction toward the source of the trouble. The crowd beneath the Roberts family were coming ever closer. "Come on," said Fred, grabbing Ginny's hand and starting to pull her toward the wood. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and George followed. They all looked back as they reached the trees. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was larger than ever. They could see the ministry wizards trying to get through to They could see the ministry wizards trying to get through it to the hooded wizards in the center, but they were having great difficulty. It looked as though they were scared to perform any spell that might make the Roberts family fall. Arresto Momentum? Could they try that? I mean, that's a spell that's exclusively used in the films, but I imagine they consulted J.K. Rowling on that. I'm sure it's not a spell they just made up for the movie. But that's the spell I would use. If they, were to fall. I would have somebody keep watch. I would, incapacitate the, Death Eaters. That's what they are. They haven't been named yet, but that's what they are. And have other wizards watching so that when they start to fall, they would do Arresto Momentum. The colored lanterns that had lit the path to the stadium had been extinguished. Dark figures were blundering through the trees. Children were crying. Anxious shouts and panicked voices were reverberating around them in the cold night air. Harry felt himself being pushed hither and thither by people whose faces he could not see. Then he heard Ron yell with pain. "What happened?" said Hermione anxiously, stopping so abruptly that Harry walked into her. "Ron, where are you? Oh, this is stupid. Lumos." She illuminated her wand and directed its narrow beam across the path. Ron was lying sprawled on the ground. "Tripped over a tree root," he said angrily, getting to his feet again. "Oh, not now. Not now. I will strangle you." Oh my God. I don't need this right now. We don't need this. Nobody needs this right now. "Well, with feet that size, hard not to," said a drawling voice from behind them. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned sharply. Draco Malfoy was standing alone nearby, leaning against a tree, looking utterly relaxed. "You mean looking like a douchebag? Because that's exactly what he looks like." I'm going to write that. His arms folded, he seemed to have been watching the scene at the campsite through a gap in the trees. The only thing he's missing is a green apple. Then he'll really complete the douchebag look. He just needs to be tossing it in the air, or taking a bite out of it or something. That's what he needs. Ron told Malfoy to do something that Harry knew he would never have dared say in front of Mrs. Weasley. Oh, I think we can guess what he said. I can make a good, educated guess what he said. "Ooh, language, Weasley," said Malfoy, his pale eyes glittering. "And you better be hurrying along now. You wouldn't like her spotted, would you? You wouldn't..." Yeah, that's right. He nodded at Hermione, and at that same moment a blast like a bomb sounded from the campsite, and a flash of green light momentarily lit the trees around them. "Don't engage him. Just walk away. Why are we even talking to this fool?" "What's that supposed to mean?" said Hermione defiantly. "Granger, they're after muggles," said Malfoy. "Do you want to be showing off your knickers in midair? Because if you do, hang around. They're moving this way, and it would give us all a laugh." "Hermione's a witch," Harry snarled. "Have it your way, Potter," said Malfoy, grinning maliciously. "If you think they can't spot a mudblood, stay where you are." "You watch your mouth," shouted Ron. Everybody present knew that mudblood was a very offensive term for a witch or wizard of muggle parentage. "Never mind, Ron," said Hermione quickly, seizing Ron's arm to restrain him as he took a step toward Malfoy. There came a bang from the other side of the trees that was louder than anything they had heard. Several people nearby screamed. Malfoy chuckled softly. "Scare easily, don't they?" he said lazily. "I suppose your daddy told you all to hide. What's he up to? Trying to rescue the muggles?" "Where are your parents?" said Harry, his temper rising. "Out there wearing masks, are they?" "Yup." Probably. Malfoy turned his face to Harry, still smiling. "Well, if they were, I wouldn't be likely to tell you, would I, Potter?" "Oh, come on," said Hermione with a disgusted look at Malfoy. "Let's go and find the others." "Keep that big bushy head down, Granger," sneered Malfoy. "Come on." Did I say sneered? Yeah, sneered Malfoy. "Come on," Hermione repeated, and she pulled Harry and Ron up the path again. "I'll bet you anything his dad is one of that masked lot," said Ron hotly. "Well, with any luck, the Ministry will catch him," said Hermione fervently. "Oh, I can't believe this. Where have the others got to?" Fred, George, and Ginny were nowhere to be seen, though the path was packed with plenty of other people, all looking nervously over their shoulders toward the commotion back at the campsite. A huddle of teenagers in pajamas were arguing vociferously a little way along the path. When they saw Harry, Ron, and Hermione, a girl with thick curly hair turned and said quickly, "Où est Madame Maxime? Nous..." It's been a long time since I've read French. "Nous l'avons perdu." "Où est Madame Maxime? Nous l'avons perdu." What?" said Ron. "Oh," the girl who had spoken turned her back on him, and as they walked on, they distinctly heard her say, "Hogwarts." "Beauxbatons," muttered Hermione. "Sorry?" said Harry. "They must go to Beauxbatons," said Hermione. "You know, Beauxbatons Academy of Magic. I read about it in an appraisal of magical education in Europe." "Oh, yeah, right," said Harry. "Fred and George can't have gone that far," said Ron, pulling out his wand, lighting it like Hermione's, and squinting up the path. Harry dug in the pockets of his jacket of his own wand, but it wasn't there. The only thing he could find was his omnioculars. "Oh no, I don't believe it! I've lost my wand!" "You're kidding." Ron and Hermione raised their wands high enough to spread the narrow beams of light farther on the ground. Harry looked all around him, but his wand was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe it's back in the tent," said Ron. "Maybe it fell out of your pocket when we were running?" Hermione suggested anxiously. "Yeah," said Harry. "Maybe." He usually kept his wand with him at all times in the wizarding world, and finding himself without it in the midst of a scene like this made him feel very vulnerable. A rustling noise nearby made all three of them jump. Winky the house elf was fighting her way out of a clump of bushes nearby. This is important. Pay attention. She was moving in a most peculiar fashion, apparently with great difficulty. It was as though someone invisible was trying to hold her back. Interesting description, that. That's crazy. That's crazy talk. "There is bad wizards about," she squeaked distractedly as she leaned forward and labored to keep running. "People high in the air. Winky is getting out of the way." And she disappeared into the trees on the other side of the path, panting and squeaking as she fought the force that was restraining her. "What's up with her?" said Ron, looking curiously after Winky. "Why can't she run properly?" "But she didn't ask permission to hide," said Harry. He was thinking of Dobby. Every time he had tried to do something the Malfoys wouldn't like, the house elf had been forced, I forgot to mark this, to start beating himself up. "You know, house elves got a very raw deal," said Hermione indignantly. "It's slavery, that's what it is. Then Mr. Crouch made her go up to the top of the stadium, and she was terrified, and he got her bewitched, so she can't even run while they start trampling tents. Why doesn't anyone do something about it?" "Well, the elves are happy, aren't they?" Ron said. "You heard old Winky back at the match. House elves is not supposed to have fun. That's what she likes, being bossed around." "It's people like you, Ron," Hermione began hotly, "who prop up rotten and unjust systems just because they're too lazy to..." Another loud bang echoed from the edge of the wood. Okay. I just like to mark points of injustice, especially involving house elves. It's just an interesting take, because the elves seem to enjoy their slavery, but then you turn it around and realize, oh wait, maybe they don't. We'll talk about that later as it comes up. I just think it's interesting. "Let's just keep moving, shall we?" said Ron, and Harry saw him glance edgily at Hermione. Perhaps there was truth in what Malfoy had said. Perhaps Hermione was in more danger than they were. They set off again, Harry still searching his pockets, even though he knew his wand wasn't there. They followed the dark path deeper into the woods, still keeping an eye out for Fred, George, and Ginny. They passed a group of goblins who were cackling over a sack of gold they had undoubtedly won betting on the match. This is also important. And who seemed quite unperturbed by the trouble at the campsite. We'll hear about them later as well. And I want to mark this bit too. I mark important clues for the plot. I marked with a star, and that's what I was doing there. Farther still along the path, they walked into a patch of silvery light. And when they looked through the trees, they saw 3 tall and beautiful Vila standing in a clearing, surrounded by a gaggle of young wizards, all of whom were talking very loudly. "I'd pull down about 100 sacks of galleons a year," one of them shouted. "I'm a dragon killer for the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures." Yeah, I don't believe that at all. "No, you're not," yelled his friend. "You're a dishwasher at the Leaky Cauldron." "But I'm a vampire hunter. I've killed about 90 so far." Yeah, I'm sure you have. Oh. A third young wizard, whose pupils were visible even by the dim silvery light of the Vila, now cut in. "I'm about to become the youngest ever Minister of Magic, I am." Harry snorted with laughter. He recognized... Oh, it's Stan! He recognized the pimply wizard. His name was Stan Shunpike, and he was, in fact, a conductor on the triple-decker night bus. He turned to tell Ron this, but Ron's face had gone oddly slack. And next... Oh, geez. Ron! Stay with us. And next second, Ron was yelling, "Did I tell you I've invented a broomstick that'll reach Jupiter?" "Honestly," said Hermione, and she and Harry grabbed Ron firmly by the arms, wheeled him around, and marched him away. By the time the sounds of the Vila and their admirers had faded completely, they were in the very heart of the wood. They seemed to be alone now. Everything was much quieter. Harry looked around. "I reckon we can just wait here, you know. We'll hear anyone coming a mile off." The words were hardly out of his mouth when Ludo Bagman emerged from behind a tree right ahead of them. Even by the feeble light of the 2 wands, Harry could see that a great change had come over Bagman. He no longer looked buoyant and rosy-faced. There was no more spring in his step. He looked very white and strained. "Who's that?" he said, blinking down at them, trying to make out their faces. "What are you doing in here, all alone?" They looked at one another, surprised. "Well, there's sort of a riot going on," said Ron. Bagman stared at him. "What?" "At the campsite. Some people have got hold of a family of muggles." Bagman swore loudly. "Damn them," he said, looking quite distracted, and without another word, he disapparated with a small pop. I have no idea what's going on. No clue what's going on in this bit. I don't remember what Bagman is up to in this particular scene. No clue. Not exactly on top of things, Mr. Bagman, is he? Oh, I thought it was Ron who said that. Not exactly on top of things, Mr. Bagman, is he? Said Hermione, frowning. He was a great beater, though, said Ron, leading the way off the path into a small clearing and sitting down on a patch of dry grass at the foot of a tree. The Wimborne Wasps won the league 3 times in a row while he was with them. He took a small figure of Crumb out of his pocket and set it down on the ground and watched it walk around. Like the real Crumb, the model was slightly duck-footed and round-shouldered, much less impressive on his splayed feet than on his broomstick. Harry was listening for noise from the campsite. Everything seemed much quieter. Perhaps the riot was over. I hope the others are okay, said Hermione after a while. They'll be fine, said Ron. Imagine if your dad catches Lucius Malfoy, said Harry, sitting down next to Ron and watching the small figure of Crumb slouching over the fallen leaves. He's always said he'd like to get something on him. Dad wiped the smirk off old Draco's face, all right, said Ron. Those poor muggles, though, said Hermione nervously. What if they can't get them down? They will, said Ron reassuringly. They'll find a way. Mad, though, to do something like that when the whole Ministry of Magic's out here tonight, said Hermione. I mean, how did they expect to get away with it? Do you think they've been drinking, or are they just... But she broke off abruptly and looked over her shoulder. Harry and Ron looked quickly around, too. It sounded as though someone was staggering toward their clearing. They waited, listening to the sounds of the uneven steps behind the dark trees, but the footsteps came to a sudden halt. Hello? Called Harry. There was silence. Harry got to his feet and peered around the tree. It was too dark to see very far, but he could sense somebody standing just beyond the range of his vision. "Who's there?" he said. And then, without warning, the silence was rent by a voice unlike any they had heard in the wood, and it uttered, not a panic shout, but what sounded like a spell. "Most Malta!" And something vast, green, and glittering erupted from the patch of darkness Harry's eyes had been struggling to penetrate. It flew up over the treetops and into the sky. "What the—" gasped Ron as he sprang to his feet again, staring up at the thing that had appeared. For a split second, Harry thought it was another leprechaun formation. Then he realized that it was a colossal skull comprised of what looked like emerald stars, and a serpent protruding from its mouth like a tongue. As they watched, it rose higher and higher, blazing in a haze of greenish smoke, etched against the black sky like a new constellation. Suddenly, the wood all around them erupted with screams. Harry didn't understand why, but the only possible cause was the sudden appearance of the skull, which had now risen high enough to illuminate the entire wood like some grisly neon sign. He scanned the darkness for the person who had conjured the skull, but he couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" he called again. "Harry, come on, move!" Hermione had seized the collar of his jacket and was tugging him backward. "What's the matter?" Harry said, startled to see her face so white and terrified. "It's the Dark Mark, Harry," Hermione moaned, pulling him as hard as she could. "You know whose sign?" "Voldemort's. Harry, come on!" Harry turned. Ron was hurriedly scooping up his miniature crumb, the three of them starting across the clearing. But before they had taken a few hurried steps, a series of popping noises announced the arrival of 20 wizards appearing from thin air surrounding them. Harry whirled around, and in an instant he registered one fact. Each of these wizards had his wand out, and every wand was pointing right at himself, Ron, and Hermione. Without pausing to think, he yelled, "Duck!" He seized the other two and pulled them down onto the ground. "Stupefy!" roared 20 voices. There was a blinding series of flashes, and Harry felt the hair on his head ripple as though a powerful wind had swept the clearing. Raising his head a fraction of an inch, he saw jets of fiery red light flying over them from the wizards' wands, crossing one another, bouncing off 3 trunks, rebounding into the darkness. Oh, that part is in the book. Oh, that's awesome. I love that part. "Stop!" yelled a voice he recognized. "Stop! That's my son!" I love that. "Dad to the rescue." Harry's hair stopped blowing about. He raised his head a little higher. The wizard in front of him had lowered his wand. He rolled over and saw Mr. Weasley striding toward them, looking terrified. "Ron, Harry," his voice sounded shaky. "Hermione, are you all right?" "Out of the way, Arthur," said a cold, curt voice. It was Mr. Crouch. He and the other Ministry wizards were closing in on them. Harry got to his feet to face them. Mr. Crouch's face was taut with rage. "Which of you did it?" he snapped, his sharp eyes darting between them. "Which of you conjured the Dark Mark?" "We didn't do that," said Harry, gesturing up at the skull. "We didn't do anything," said Ron, who was rubbing his elbow and looking indignantly at his father. "What did you want to attack us for?" Do not lie, sir," shouted Mr. Crouch. His wand was still pointing directly at Ron, and his eyes were popping. He looked slightly mad. "You have been discovered at the scene of the crime." "Barty," whispered a witch in a long woolen dressing gown. "They're kids, Barty. They'd never have been able to. Where did the mark come from, you... Oh, so I thought that was Barty Crouch. "Where did the mark come from, you 3? said Mr. Weasley quickly. "Over there," said Hermione shakily, pointing at the place where they had heard the voice. "There was someone behind the trees. They shouted words. An incantation." "Oh, stood over there, did they?" said Mr. Crouch, turning his popping eyes on Hermione now, disbelief etched all over his face. "Said an incantation, did they? You seem very well informed about how that mark is summoned, Missy." Isn't that how most spells are cast? By saying an incantation? I'm sure... Huh? But none of the Ministry wizards, apart from Mr. Crouch, seemed to think it remotely likely that Harry, Ron, or Hermione had conjured the skull. On the contrary, at Hermione's words, they had all raised their wands again and were pointing in the direction she had indicated, squinting through the dark trees. "We're too late," said the witch in the woolen dressing gown, shaking her head. "They'll have disapparated." "I don't think so," said a wizard with a scrubby brown beard. "It was Amos Diggory, Cedric's father. Our stunners were right through those trees. There's a good chance we got them." "I must be careful," said a few of the wizards warningly, as Mr. Diggory squared his shoulders, raised his wand, marched across the clearing, and disappeared into the darkness. Hermione watched him vanish with her hands over her mouth. A few seconds later they heard Mr. Diggory shout, "Yes, we got them. There's someone here. Unconscious. It's... but... blimey." "You've got someone?" shouted Mr. Crouch, sounding highly disbelieving. "Who? Who is it?" They heard snapping twigs, the rustling of leaves, and then crouching footsteps as Mr. Diggory reemerged from behind the trees. He was carrying a tiny, limp figure in his arms. Harry recognized the tea towel at once. It was Winky. Mr. Crouch did not move or speak as Mr. Diggory deposited his elf on the ground at his feet. His elf? The elf on the ground? His elf? What? It says his. Mr. Crouch did not move or speak. Oh, okay, yes. Mr. Crouch is the subject of the sentence. That's why it says his. The other Ministry wizards were all staring at Mr. Crouch. For a few seconds, Crouch remained transfixed, his eyes blazing on his white face as he stared down at Winky. Then he appeared to come to life again. More is going on in his head than we know right now. How much left of this chapter? We're still going. We're about halfway. "This cannot be," he said jerkily. "No." He moved quickly around Mr. Diggory and strode off toward the place where he found Winky. "No point, Mr. Crouch," Mr. Diggory called after him. "There's no one else there." "Oh, I already did mark it with a star. Look at that." But Mr. Crouch did not seem prepared to take his word for it. They could hear him moving around in the rustling of trees as he pushed the bushes aside, searching. I wonder if I should talk about what's really going on, or should I wait until it's actually revealed what's going on later. Spoiler alert. But he's looking for his son, is who he's looking for. In the last chapter, Winky was saving a seat for Mr. Crouch. What she actually was doing was she was sitting next to Barty Crouch Jr. in an invisibility cloak. It's a long story. Yeah. I don't know. Should I talk about it right now? I might as well. It's a long story that we'll get to. But it's not really discussed in the movie at all. But Barty Crouch Jr. was revealed to be a Death Eater. He was sent to Azkaban. Mr. Crouch's wife was very upset about it. I mean, obviously they're upset that their son is in Azkaban, but they don't want him to rot in prison, I think. Some of the details are a little fuzzy. So the wife is dying, and she decides, I want to take my son's place. So Mr. Crouch, as a Ministry wizard, takes his wife in under the invisibility cloak, or maybe he doesn't take her under the invisibility cloak. He just takes... Oh, no, he would have to. Takes her under the invisibility cloak, takes her to Azkaban, swaps his son with his wife. She might even take Polyjuice Potion, pretending to be him, as she's in prison. And the Dementors can't see. All they can tell is feelings, and so the feelings, because Barty Crouch Jr. was also dying, they couldn't tell the difference when they swapped, when she took his place. So he took his son home, kept him trapped in his house, but he felt bad, and Winky was supposed to take care of him and look after him. Felt bad because he doesn't want his son to be trapped forever, in the house. So he's like, okay, well, we'll take him to the Quidditch World Cup, a once-in-a-lifetime event. So he lets him go to the Quidditch World Cup with Winky under the invisibility cloak, and he's also partly docile. He's got, like, the Imperious Curse on him. So he's, like, docile, and so he doesn't rebel so much. But because of Voldemort's awakening, I think, he starts to snap out of it. He starts to learn how to manage the Imperious Curse so that he's able to snap out of it and rebel. So he's actually in the stands at the Quidditch World Cup next to Winky. The seat isn't actually empty. It's actually him in an invisibility cloak sitting there. And he steals Harry's wand, by the way. That's why Harry's wand is gone. I don't know if it happens during the Quidditch match or if it happened here in the woods, but at some point he steals Harry's wand. He gets away from Winky. That's why Winky's, like, walking strange, because she's trying to hold him back, but he's too big for her. So she can't. I don't know why she didn't use magic to restrain him. I'm sure she could have, but... Anyway, he's the one who casts the Dark Mark. And Barty Crouch knows it, and that's what he's looking for. He's searching the ground, because he knows if Winky's here, then my son should have been here, is what he's thinking. So he's looking for his son, and he can't find him, because he's gone. It's a long story. Really a long story. Yeah, so Barty Crouch Jr. has been waiting for a while to find a way to escape his father, so he can return to Voldemort. Bit embarrassing, Mr. Diggory said grimly, looking down at Winky's unconscious form. Barty Crouch's house elf. I mean to say... Come off it, Amos, said Mr. Weasley quietly. You don't seriously think it was the elf? The Dark Mark's a wizard's sign. It requires a wand. Yeah, said Mr. Diggory, and she had a wand. What? Said Mr. Weasley. Here, look. Mr. Diggory held up a wand and showed it to Mr. Weasley. Had it in her hand. So that's the clause 3 of the Code of Wand Use broken, for a start. No non-human creature is permitted to carry or use a wand. Ah, discrimination. I did mark that. Just then there was another pop, and Ludo Bagman apparated right next to Mr. Weasley. Looking breathless and disoriented, he spun on the spot, goggling upward at the emerald green skull. The Dark Mark, he panted, almost trampling Winky as he turned inquiringly to his colleagues. Who did it? Did you get them? Barty, what's going on? Mr. Crouch had returned empty-handed. His face was still ghostly white, and his hands and his toothbrush mustache were both twitching. He knows what he's done. He knows that he just set his son, a maniac and Voldemort supporter, on the loose, and he can't find him. He knows he's in deep trouble. Where have you been, Barty? Said Bagman. Why weren't you at the match? Your elf was saving your seat, too. Gulping gargoyles. Bagman had just noticed Winky lying at his feet. What happened to her? See, Barty Crouch didn't go to the match. His son was sitting in his spot. I've been busy, Ludo, said Mr. Crouch, still talking in the same jerky fashion, barely moving his lips, and my elf has been stunned. Stunned? By you lot, you mean? But why? Comprehension dawned suddenly on Bagman's round, shiny face. He looked up at the skull, down at Winky, and then at Mr. Crouch. No, he said. Winky? Conjure the Dark Mark? She wouldn't know how. She'd need a wand for a start. And she had one, said Mr. Diggory. I found her holding one, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself. Crouch gave no sign that he had heard Mr. Diggory, but Mr. Diggory seemed to take his silence for assent. He raised his own wand, pointed it at Winky, and said, Innovate. Winky stirred feebly. Her great brown eyes opened, and she blinked several times in a bemused sort of way. Watched by the silent wizard, she raised herself shakily into a sitting position. She caught sight of Mr. Diggory's feet and slowly, tremulously raised her eyes to stare up into his face. Then, more slowly still, she looked up into the sky. Harry could see the floating skull reflected twice in her enormous glassy eyes. She gave a gasp, looked wildly around the crowded clearing, and burst into terrified sobs. "Elf," said Mr. Diggory sternly, do you know who I am? I'm a member of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Winky began to rock backward and forward on the ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Harry was reminded forcibly of Dobby in his moments of terrified disobedience. "As you see, Elf, the dark mark was conjured here, a short while ago," said Mr. Diggory, "and you were discovered moments later, right beneath it. An explanation, if you please." I is not doing it, sir," Winky gasped. "I is not knowing how, sir." "You were found with a wand in your hand," barked Mr. Diggory, brandishing it in front of her, and as the wand caught the green light that was filling the clearing from the skull above, Harry recognized it. "Hey, that's mine," he said. Everyone in the clearing looked at him. "Excuse me?" said Mr. Diggory incredulously. "That's my wand," said Harry. "I dropped it." "You dropped it?" repeated Mr. Diggory in disbelief. "Is this a confession? You threw it aside after you conjured the mark." "Amos, think who you're talking to," said Mr. Weasley very angrily. "It's Harry Potter. Is Harry Potter likely to conjure the dark mark?" Of course not," mumbled Mr. Diggory. "Sorry. Carried away." "I didn't drop it there, anyway," said Harry, jerking his thumb toward the trees beneath the skull. "I missed it right after we got into the wood." "So," said Mr. Diggory, his eyes hardening as he turned to look at Winky again, cowering at his feet. "You found this wand, eh, Elf? And you picked it up and thought you'd have some fun with it, did you?" "I is not doing magic with it, sir," squealed Winky, tears streaming down the sides of her squashed and bulbous nose. I is just picking it up, sir. I is not making the dark mark, sir. I is not knowing how." Yeah, she can't likely say, "I didn't take it. Barty Crouch Jr. took it." She can't say that. So she has to take the fall, and it's really sad. "It wasn't her," said Hermione. She looked very nervous, speaking up in front of all these Ministry wizards, yet determined all the same. "Winky's got a squeaky little voice, and the voice we heard during the incantation was much deeper." She looked around at Harry and Ron, appealing for their support. "It didn't sound anything like Winky, did it?" "No," said Harry, shaking his head. "It definitely didn't sound like an elf." "Yeah, it was a human voice," said Ron. "Well, we'll soon see," growled Mr. Diggory. "Just because... No, what do they call it? It's circumstantial. This evidence is purely circumstantial. Just because she had the wand, and if the wand last produced the spell, doesn't mean she cast the spell. It's like... It's as if somebody just came into my apartment, took a butcher knife out of my kitchen, and then killed somebody with it. Just because my fingerprints are on my knife, and it's my knife, doesn't mean I'm the one who killed whoever that person killed. This is exactly the same thing. It's circumstantial. There's a simple way of discovering the last spell a wand performed, Elf. Did you know that? Winky trembled and shook her head frantically, her ears flapping, as Mr. Diggory raised his own wand again and placed it tip to tip with Harry's. Is that how you say the spell? I thought it was Prari Incantatum. Prior Incantatum. Incantanto. Oh, maybe that's just the name of the spell. This is how you actually say it when you're using it, roared Mr. Diggory. Harry heard Hermione gasp, horrified as a gigantic serpent-tongued skull erupted from the point where the two wands met. But it was a mere shadow of a green skull high above them. It looked as though it was made of thick grey smoke, the ghost of a spell. "Delectrius!" Mr. Diggory shouted, and the smoky skull vanished in a wisp of smoke. "So," said Mr. Diggory with a kind of savage triumph, looking down upon Winky, who was still shaking convulsively. "I is not doing it, sir." Oh, she doesn't say sir. She squealed, her eyes rolling in terror. I is not knowing how. I is a good elf. I isn't using wands. I isn't knowing how." "You've been caught red-handed, elf," Mr. Diggory roared. "Caught with the guilty wand in your hand." "Amos," said Mr. Weasley loudly, "think about it. Precious few wizards know how to do that spell. Where would she have learned it?" "Perhaps Amos is suggesting," said Mr. Crouch, cold anger in every syllable, "that I routinely teach my servants to conjure the dark mark." There was a deeply unpleasant silence. Amos Diggory looked horrified. "Mr. Crouch, not at all. You have now come very close to accusing the two people in this clearing who are least likely to conjure that mark," barked Mr. Crouch. "Harry Potter and myself. I suppose you are familiar with the boy's story, Amos?" "Of course, everyone knows," muttered Mr. Diggory, looking highly discomforted, "and I trust you remember the many proofs I have given, over a long career, that I despise and detest the dark arts, and those who practice them." Mr. Crouch shouted, his eyes bulging again. "Mr. Crouch, I never suggested you had anything to do with it," Amos Diggory muttered again, now reddening behind his scrubby brown beard. "If you accuse my elf, you accuse me, Diggory," shouted Mr. Crouch. "Where else would she have learned to conjure it? She might have picked it up anywhere." "Precisely, Amos," said Mr. Weasley. "She might have picked it up anywhere." "Winky?" he said kindly. "Yes." Turning to the elf, but she flinched as though he, too, was shouting at her. "Where exactly did you find Harry's wand?" Winky was twisting the hem of her tea towel so violently that it was fraying beneath her fingers. I is finding it there, sir," she whispered. "There, in the trees, sir." "You see, Amos," said Mr. Weasley, "whoever conjured the mark could have disapparated right after they'd done it, leaving Harry's wand behind. A clever thing to do, not using their own wand, which could have betrayed them. And Winky here had the misfortune to come across the wand moments later and pick it up." "But then she'd have been only a few feet away from the real culprit." "Ding, ding, ding, yes," said Mr. Diggory impatiently. "Elf, did you see anyone?" Winky began to tremble worse than ever. Her giant eyes flickered from Mr. Diggory to little Bagman and onto Mr. Crouch. Then she gulped and said, "I is seeing no one, sir. No one." She's not technically lying. He was wearing an invisibility cloak, to be fair. But she knew who it was. He didn't ask her if she knew who it was. "I must," said Mr. Crouch curtly. "I am fully aware that, in the ordinary course of events, you would want to take Winky into your department for questioning. I ask you, however, to allow me to deal with her." Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of this suggestion at all, but it was clear to Harry that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the ministry that he did not dare refuse him. "You may rest assured that she will be punished," Mr. Crouch added coldly. Master," Winky stammered, looking up at Mr. Crouch, her eyes brimming with tears. "Master, please." "Oh, God." Okay. Mr. Crouch stared back, his face somehow sharpened, each line upon it more deeply etched. There was no pity in his gaze. "Winky has behaved tonight in a manner I would not have believed possible," he said slowly. "I told her to remain in the tent. I told her to stay there while I went to sort out the trouble. And I find that she disobeyed me. This means clothes." "No!" shrieked Winky, prostrating herself at Mr. Crouch's feet. "No, master! Not clothes! Not clothes!" Harry knew that the only way to turn a house elf free was to present it with proper garments. It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. "But she was frightened!" Hermione burst out angrily, glaring at Mr. Crouch. "Your elf's scared of heights, and those wizards in masks were levitating people. You can't blame her for wanting to get out of their way." Mr. Crouch took a step backward, freeing himself from contact from the elf whom he was surveying as though she was something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. "I have no use for a house elf who disobeys me," he said, coldly, looking over at Hermione. "I have no use for a servant who forgets what is due to a master, and to a master's reputation." Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing. There was a very nasty silence, which was ended by Mr. Weasley, who said quietly, "Well, I think I'll take my lot back to the tent if nobody's got any objections. Amos, that once told us all it can. If Harry could have it back, please." Miss Diggory handed Harry his wand, and Harry pocketed it. "Come on, you three," Mr. Weasley said quietly, but Hermione didn't seem to want to move. Her eyes were still upon the sobbing elf. "Hermione," Mr. Weasley said more urgently. She turned and followed Harry and ran out of the clearing and off through the trees. "What's going to happen to Winky?" said Hermione, the moment they had left the clearing. "I don't know," said Mr. Weasley. "The way they were treating her," said Hermione furiously. "Mr. Diggory calling her elf all the time. And Mr. Crouch, he knows she didn't do it, and he's still going to sack her. He didn't care how frightened she'd been, or how upset she was. It was like she wasn't even human." "Well, she's not," said Ron. Hermione rounded on him. "That doesn't mean she hasn't got feelings, Ron. It's disgusting the way—" "Hermione, I agree with you," said Mr. Weasley quickly, beckoning her on. "But now it's not the time to discuss elf rights. I want to get back to the tent as fast as we can. What happened to the others?" "We lost them in the dark," said Ron. "Dad, why was everyone so uptight about that skull thing?" "I'll explain everything back at the tent," said Mr. Weasley tensely. But when they reached the edge of the wood, their progress was impeded. A large crowd of frightened-looking witches and wizards were congregated there, and when they saw Mr. Weasley coming toward them, many of them surged forward. "What's going on in there? Who conjured it? Arthur, it's not him." "Of course it's not him," said Mr. Weasley impatiently. "We don't know who it was. It looks like they disapparated. Now excuse me, please. I want to get to bed." He led Harry, Ron, and Hermione through the crowd and back into the campsite. All was quiet now. There was no sign of the masked wizards, though several ruined tents were still smoking. Charlie's head was poking out of the boys' tent. "Dad, what's going on?" he called through the dark. "Fred, George, and Ginny got back okay, but the others—" "I've got them here," said Mr. Weasley, bending down and entering the tent. Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered after him. Bill was sitting at the small kitchen table, holding a bedsheet to his arm, which was bleeding profusely. Charlie had a large rip in his shirt, and Percy was sporting a bloody nose. Fred, George, and Ginny looked unhurt, though shaken. "Did you get them, Dad?" said Bill sharply. "The person who conjured the mark." "No," said Mr. Weasley. "We found Barty Crouch's elf holding Harry's wand, but we're none the wiser about who actually conjured the mark." "What?" said Bill, Charlie, and Percy together. "Harry's wand," said Fred. "Mr. Crouch's elf?" said Percy, sounding thunderstruck. With some assistance from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, Mr. Weasley explained what had happened in the woods. When they had finished their story, Percy swelled indignantly. "Well, Mr. Crouch is quite right to get rid of an elf like that," he said, "running away when he'd expressly told her not to, embarrassing him in front of the whole ministry. How would that have looked if she'd been brought up in front of the Department of the Regulation and Control? She didn't do anything. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Hermione snapped at Percy, who looked very taken aback. Hermione had always got on fairly well with Percy, better indeed than any of the others. See, we can kind of see his personality. Well, I mean, we've always seen his personality, but you can see the direction he's heading for the next one. Hermione, a wizard in Mr. Crouch's position, can't afford a house elf who's going to run amok with a wand, said Percy pompously, recovering himself. She didn't run amok, shouted Hermione. She just picked it up off the ground. Look, can someone just explain what that skull thing was? Said Ron impatiently. It wasn't hurting anyone. Why is it such a big deal? I told you, it's you-know-who's symbol, Ron, said Hermione before anyone else could answer. I read about it in The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts. And it hasn't been seen for 13 years, said Mr. Weasley, quietly. Of course, people panicked. It was almost like seeing you-know-who back again. I don't get it, said Ron, frowning. I mean, it's still only a shape in the sky. Ron, you-know-who and his followers sent the Dark Mark into the air whenever they killed, said Mr. Weasley. The terror inspired. You've no idea, you're too young. Just picture coming home and finding the Dark Mark hovering over your house, and knowing what you're about to find inside. Mr. Weasley winced. Everyone's worst fear. The very worst. There was silence for a moment. Then Bill, removing the sheet from his arm to check on his cut, said, Well, it didn't help us tonight, whoever conjured it. It scared the Death Eaters away the moment they saw it. They all disapparated before we'd got near enough to unmask any of them. Yep. Because Voldemort didn't want any of that. That wasn't his idea at all. In fact, it was stupid of them to do. And so then when Barty Crouch Jr., his true and faithful servant, conjured the mark, he purposefully scared away the Death Eaters who he believed were acting foolishly. We caught the Robertses before they hit the ground, though. They're having their memories modified right now. Death Eaters, said Harry. What are Death Eaters? First time being mentioned. It's what you-know-who supporters called themselves, said Bill. I think we saw what's left of them tonight. The ones who managed to keep themselves out of Azkaban, anyway. We can't prove it was them, Bill, said Mr. Weasley, though it probably was, he added hopelessly. Yeah, I bet it was, said Ron suddenly. Dad, we met Draco Malfoy in the woods, and he as good as told us his dad was one of those nutters in masks. And we all know the Malfoys were right in with you-know-who. But what were Voldemort's supporters? Harry began. Everybody flinched. Like most of the Wizarding World, the Weasleys always avoided saying Voldemort's name. Sorry, said Harry, quickly. What were you-know-who supporters up to, levitating muggles? I mean, what was the point? The point? Said Mr. Weasley with a hollow laugh. Harry, that's their idea of fun. Half the muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. I suppose they had a few drinks tonight and couldn't resist reminding us all the lots of them are still at large. A nice little reunion for them, he finished disgustedly. But if they were the Death Eaters, why did they disapparate when they saw the Dark Mark, said Ron. They'd have been pleased to see it, wouldn't they? Use your brains, Ron, said Bill. If they really were Death Eaters, they worked very hard to keep out of Azkaban when you-know-who lost power, and told all sorts of lies about him, forcing them to kill and torture people. I bet they'd be even more frightened than the rest of us to see him come back. They denied they'd ever been involved with him when he lost his powers, and went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be overpleased with them, do you? So, whoever conjured the Dark Mark, said Hermione slowly, were they doing it to show support for the Death Eaters, or to scare them away? Your guess is as good as ours, Hermione, said Mr. Weasley, but I'll tell you this. It was only the Death Eaters who ever knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who did it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even if they're not now. Listen, it's very late, and if your mother hears what's happened, she'll be worried sick. We'll get a few more hours sleep, and then try and get an early portkey out of here. I had an impulse. I had a thought. Just leave her a text. Just tell her you're okay. That wasn't really a thing, even for muggles, when this book was published. Although, there's wizard ways you could send messages quickly. Relatively quickly. He probably could have done something. Harry got back into his bunk with his head buzzing. He knew he ought to feel exhausted. It was nearly 3 a.m, but he felt wide awake and worried. 3 days ago, it felt like much longer, but it had only been, yeah, it does feel much longer, but it had only been 3 days. He had awoken with his scar burning, and tonight, for the first time in 13 years, Lord Voldemort's mark had appeared in the sky. What did these things mean? He thought of the letter he had written to Sirius before leaving Privet Drive. Would Sirius have gotten it yet? When would he reply? Harry lay looking up at the canvas, but no flying fantasies came to him now to ease him to sleep, and it was a long time after Charlie's snores filled the tent that Harry finally dozed off. Yep. I would venture a guess that something big is happening in the Wizarding World. Alright, but that's the end of Chapter 9, and that was super long, and I think the next one's long, too. Chapter 10, Mayhem at the Ministry. I don't even really remember what happens in this next chapter. It's not quite as long. It's about a normal size. Alright. But before we read Chapter 10, we are going to have a 15-minute intermission. I hope you are enjoying the stream. Please talk in the chat if you want to discuss anything. Leave a comment if you so desire. Click the like button if you like the video. And become a subscriber if you're not subscribed already. Turn on notifications so you can be notified when I upload and when I go live. I'll be going live next weekend. Friday, more Plague's Tale, and Saturday, more reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. If you'd like to know when, follow me on Twitter, link in the description. Also in the description is my Patreon if you'd like to support me, or if you'd like to read my writing, there's plenty of free stuff on there too, including a prologue from my new Harry Potter fanfiction, which is free for everybody. And I also have a TikTok and an Instagram, so check those out as well. And I will be right back. Alright, so let's get into Chapter 10, Mayhem at the Ministry. Mr. Weasley woke them after only a few hours' sleep. He used magic to pack up the tents, and they left the campsite as quickly as possible, passing Mr. Roberts at the door of his cottage. Mr. Roberts had a strange, dazed look about him, and he waved them off with a vague, "Merry Christmas." Oh. "He'll be all right," said Mr. Weasley quietly as they marched off onto the moor. "Sometimes, when a person's memory's modified, it makes him a bit disoriented for a while. And that was a big thing they had to make him forget." They heard urgent voices as they approached the spot where the portcaves lay, and when they reached it, they found a great number of witches and wizards gathered around Basil, the keeper of the portkeys, all clamoring to get away from the campsite as quickly as possible. Mr. Weasley had a hurried discussion with Basil. They joined the queue and were able to take an old rubber tire back to Stout's Head Hill before the sun had really risen. They walked back through Ottery St. Catchpole and up the damp lane toward the burrow in the dawn light, talking very little because they were so exhausted, and thinking longingly of their breakfast. Oh, I'm thinking longingly of breakfast, too. As they rounded the corner and the burrow came into view, a cry echoed across the lane. "Oh, thank goodness! Thank goodness!" I know, you couldn't shoot her a text? Mrs. Weasley, who had evidently been waiting for them in the front yard, came running toward them, still wearing her bedroom slippers, her face pale and strained, a rolled-up copy of the Daily Prophet clutched in her hand. "Arthur, I've been so worried, so worried." She flung her arms around Mr. Weasley's neck, and the Daily Prophet fell out of her limp hand onto the ground. Looking down, Harry saw the headline, "Scenes of Terror at the Quidditch World Cup," complete with a twinkling black and white photograph of the dark mark over the treetops. "You're all right," Mrs. Weasley muttered distractedly, releasing Mr. Weasley and staring around at them all with red eyes. "You're alive. Oh, boys!" And to everybody's surprise, she seized Fred and George and pulled them both into such a tight hug that their heads banged together. "Ouch! Mum, you're strangling us. I shouted at you before you left," Mrs. Weasley said. "Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that." Starting to sob, "It's all I've been thinking about. What if you know who had got you, and the last thing I ever said to you was that you didn't get enough owls? Oh, Fred, George." "Come on now, Molly, we're all perfectly okay," said Mr. Weasley soothingly, prizing her off the twins and leading her back toward the house. "Bill," he added in an undertone, "pick up the paper. I want to see what it says." When they were all crammed into the tiny kitchen, and Hermione had made Mrs. Weasley a cup of very strong tea, into which Mr. Weasley insisted on pouring a shot of Ogden's old fire whiskey, Bill handed his father the newspaper. Mr. Weasley scanned the front page while Percy looked over his shoulder. "I knew it," said Mr. Weasley heavily. "Ministry blunders. Culprits not apprehended. Lack security. Dark wizards running unchecked. National disgrace. Who wrote this? Ah, of course. Rita Skeeter. That woman's got it in for the Ministry of Magic, said Percy furiously. Last week she was saying we're wasting our time, quibbling about cauldron thickness, when we should be stamping out vampires. As if it wasn't specifically stated in paragraph 12 of the guidelines for the treatment of non-wizard part humans. Do us a favor, Puss, said Bill, yawning, and shut up. I'm mentioned, said Mr. Weasley, his eyes widening behind his glasses as he reached the bottom of the Daily Prophet article. Where? Sputtered Mrs. Weasley, choking on her tea and whiskey. If I'd seen that, I'd have known you were alive. Not by name, said Mr. Weasley. Listen to this. If the terrified wizards and witches who waited breathlessly for news at the edge of the wood expected reassurance from the Ministry of Magic, they were sadly disappointed. A ministry official emerged some time after the appearance of the Dark Mark, alleging that nobody had been hurt, but refusing to give any more information. Whether this statement will be enough to quash the rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods an hour later remains to be seen. Oh, really, said Mr. Weasley in exasperation, handing the paper to Percy. Nobody was hurt. What was I supposed to say? Rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods. Well, there certainly will be rumors now she's printed that. He heaved a deep sigh. Molly, I'm going to have to go into the office. This is going to take some smoothing over. I'll come with you, Father, said Percy importantly. Mr. Crouch will need all hands on deck, and I can give him my cauldron report in person. He bustled out of the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley looked most upset. Arthur, you're supposed to be on a holiday. This hasn't got anything to do with your office. Surely they can handle this without you. I've got to go, Molly, said Mr. Weasley. I've made things worse. I'll just change into my robes and I'll be off. Mrs. Weasley, said Harry suddenly, unable to contain himself, Hedwig hasn't arrived with a letter for me, has she? Hedwig, dear? Said Mrs. Weasley distractedly. No, there hasn't been any post at all. Ron and Hermione looked curiously at Harry. With a meaningful look at both of them, he said, All right if I go and dump my stuff in your room, Ron? Yeah, think I will too, said Ron at once. Hermione? Yes, she said quickly, and the three of them marched out of the kitchen and up the stairs. What's up, Harry? Said Ron, the moment they had closed the door of the attic room behind them. Something I haven't told you, Harry said. On Saturday morning I woke up with my skull hurting again. Ron's and Hermione's reactions were almost exactly as Harry had imagined them, back in his bedroom on Privet Drive. Hermione gasped and started making suggestions at once, mentioning a number of reference books, and everybody from Albus Dumbledore to Madame Pomfrey, the Hogwarts nurse. Ron simply looked dumbstruck. But he wasn't there, was he? You know who I mean. Last time your skull kept hurting, he was at Hogwarts, wasn't he? I'm sure he wasn't on Privet Drive, said Harry. But I was dreaming about him. Him and Peter. You know, Wormtail. I can't remember all of it now, but they were plotting to kill someone. He had teetered for a moment on the verge of saying me, but couldn't bring himself to make Hermione look any more horrified than she already did. It was only a dream, said Ron bracingly. Just a nightmare. Yeah, but was it, though? Said Harry, turning to look out the window at the brightening sky. It's weird, isn't it? My scar hurts, and 3 days later the Death Eaters are out the match, and Voldemort's sign's up in the sky again. Don't say his name, Ron hissed through gritted teeth. And remember what Professor Trelawney said, Harry went on, ignoring Ron. The end of last year? Professor Trelawney was their divination teacher at Hogwarts. Hermione's terrified look vanished as she let out a derisive snort. Oh, Harry, you aren't going to pay attention to anything that old fraud says. You weren't there, said Harry. You didn't hear her. This time was different. I told you, she was into a trance. She went into a trance. A real one. And she said the Dark Lord would rise again. Greater and more terrible than ever before. And he'd manage it because his servant was going to go back to him. And that night Wormtail escaped. There was a silence in which Ron fidgeted absent-mindedly with a hole in his Chudley Cannon's bedspread. Why were you asking if Hedwig had come, Harry? Said Hermione asked. Are you expecting a letter? I told Sirius about my scar, said Harry, shrugging. I'm waiting for his answer. Good thinking, said Ron, his expression clearing. I bet Sirius will know what to do. I hope he'd get back to me quickly, said Harry. But we don't know where Sirius is. He could be in Africa or somewhere, couldn't he? Said Hermione reasonably. Hedwig's not going to manage that journey in a few days. Yeah, I know, said Harry, but there was a leaden feeling in his stomach as he looked out of the window at the Hedwig-free sky. Oh, geez, no. How are you still in the mood for Quidditch? Come and have a game of Quidditch in the orchard, Harry, said Ron. Come on, 3-on-3. Bill and Charlie and Fred and George will play. You can try out the Wronski feint. Ron, said Hermione in a I don't think you're being very sensitive sort of voice, Harry doesn't want to play Quidditch right now. He's worried and tired. We all need to go to bed. Yeah, I want to play Quidditch, said Harry suddenly. Shut up, Hermione, you don't know anything. said Harry suddenly. Hang on, I'll get my firebolt. Hermione left the room muttering something that sounded very much like, boys. They're icky. Neither Mr. Weasley nor Percy was at home much over the following week. Both left the house each morning before the rest of the family got up, and returned well after dinner every night. It's been an absolute uproar, Percy told them importantly that Sunday evening before they were due to return to Hogwarts. I've been putting out fires all week. People keep sending howlers, and of course, if you don't open a howler straight away, it explodes. Scorch marks all over my desk, and my best quill reduced to cinders. Why are they all sending howlers? Asked Ginny, who was mending her copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi with spell tape on the rug in front of the living room fire. Complaining about security at the World Cup, said Percy. They want compensation for their ruined property. Mundungus Fletcher's put in a claim for a 12-bedroom tent with an ensuite jacuzzi, but I've got his number. I know for a fact he was sleeping under a cloak propped up on sticks. I was about to say, did he steal it? 'Cause that wouldn't surprise me either. Mundungus Fletcher. Mrs. Weasley glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. Harry liked this clock. It was completely useless if you wanted to know the time, but otherwise very informative. It had 9 golden hands, and each of them was engraved with one of the Weasley family's names. There were no numerals over the face, but descriptions of where each family member might be. Home, school, and work were there, but there was also traveling, lost, hospital, prison, and in the position where the number 12 would be on a normal clock, mortal peril. 8 of the hands are currently pointing to the home. So then wouldn't she know? Wouldn't Mrs. Weasley know that her family was okay? Eight of the hands currently pointing to the home position, but Mr. Weasley's, which was the longest, was still pointing to work. Mrs. Weasley sighed. Your father hasn't had to go into the office on weekends since the days of you-know-who, she said. They're working him far too hard. His dinner's going to be ruined if he doesn't come home soon. Well, father feels he's got to make up for his mistake at the match, doesn't he? Said Percy. If truth be told, he was a tad unwise to make a public statement without clearing up his head of department first. Oh, Percy, you can already see it. You can already see the divide going on. Don't you dare blame your father for what that wretched Skeeter woman wrote, said Mrs. Weasley, flaring up at once. If Dad hadn't said anything, old Rita would have said it was disgraceful that nobody from the ministry had commented, said Bill, who was playing chess with Ron. Rita Skeeter never makes anyone look good. Remember she interviewed all the Gringotts charm breakers once and called me a long-haired Pullock. Well, it is a bit long, dear, said Mrs. Weasley gently. If you'd just let me... No, Mom. Rain lashed against the living room window. Hermione was immersed in the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4, copies of which Mrs. Weasley had bought her, Harry, and Ron in Diagon Alley. Charlie was darning a fireproof balaclava. Harry was polishing his firebolt, the broomstick servicing kit Hermione had given him for his 13th birthday open at his feet. Fred and George were sitting in a far corner, quills out, talking in whispers, their heads bent over a piece of parchment. "What are you two up to?" said Mrs. Weasley sharply, her eyes on the twins. "Homework," said Fred vaguely. "Yeah, as if anyone believes that." "Don't be ridiculous." "You're still on holiday," said Mrs. Weasley. "Yeah, we left it a bit late," said George. "You're not by any chance writing out a new order form, are you?" said Mrs. Weasley shrewdly. "You wouldn't be thinking of restarting Weasley's Wizard Wheezes by any chance?" "Now, Mum," said Fred, looking up at her, a pained look on his face, "if the Hogwarts Express crashed tomorrow, and George and I died, how would you feel to know the last thing we ever heard from you was an unfounded accusation?" Everyone laughed, even Mrs. Weasley. "Oh, your father's coming," she said suddenly, looking up at the clock again. Mr. Weasley's hand had suddenly spun from work to traveling. A second later had shuddered to a halt on home with the others, and they heard him calling from the kitchen. "Coming, Arthur," called Mrs. Weasley, hurrying out of the room. A few moments later, Mr. Weasley came into the warm living room, carrying his dinner on a tray. He looked completely exhausted. "Well, the fat's really in the fire now," he told Mrs. Weasley as he sat down in an armchair near the hearth and toyed unenthusiastically with his somewhat shriveled cauliflower. Rita Skeeter's has been ferreting around all week, looking for more ministry mess-ups to report. And now she's found out about poor old Bertha going missing. So that'll be the headline in the Prophet tomorrow. I told Bagman he should have sent someone to look for her ages ago. "Mr. Crouch has been saying it for weeks and weeks," said Percy swiftly. "Crouch is very lucky Rita hasn't found out about Winky," said Mr. Weasley irritably. "There'd be a week's worth of headlines in his house elf, being caught holding the wand that conjured the Dark Mark." "I thought we were all agreed that the elf, while irresponsible, did not conjure the mark," said Percy hotly. "If you ask me, Mr. Crouch is very lucky no one at the Daily Prophet knows how mean he is to the elves," said Hermione angrily. "Now look here, Hermione," said Percy. "A high-ranking ministry official like Mr. Crouch deserves unswerving obedience from his servants. His slave, you mean," said Hermione, her voice rising passionately, "because he didn't pay Winky, did he?" "I think you'd all better go upstairs and check that you've packed properly," said Mrs. Weasley, breaking up the argument. "Come on now, all of you." Harry repacked his broomstick servicing kit, put his firebolt over his shoulder, and went back upstairs with Ron. The rain sounded even louder at the top of the house, accompanied by loud whistlings and moans from the wind, not to mention sporadic howls from the ghoul who lived in the attic. Pigwidgeon began twittering and zooming around in his cage when they entered. The sight of the half-packed trunks seemed to have sent him into a frenzy of excitement. "Bung him some owl treats," said Ron, throwing a packet across to Harry. "It might shut him up." Harry poked a few owl treats through the bars of Pigwidgeon's cage, then turned to his trunk. Hedwig's cage stood next to it, still empty. "It's been over a week," Harry said, looking at Hedwig's deserted perch. "Ron, you don't reckon Sirius has been caught, do you?" "Nah, it would have been in the Daily Prophet," said Ron. "The Ministry would want to show they'd caught someone, wouldn't they?" "Yeah, I suppose. Look, here's the stuff Mom got for you in Diagon Alley, and she's got some gold out of your vault for you, and she's washed all your socks." He heaved a pile of parcels onto Harry's camp bed and dropped the money bag and a load of socks next to it. Harry started unwrapping the shopping. Apart from the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4 by Miranda Goshawk, he had a handful of new quills, a dozen rolls of parchment, and refills for his potion-making kit. But he had been running low on spine of lionfish and essence of belladonna. He was just piling underwear into his cauldron when Ron made a loud noise of disgust behind him. "What's that supposed to be?" He was holding up something that looked to Harry like a long maroon velvet dress. Oh my god, I forgot about this! I was like, where's this going? He was holding up something that looked to Harry like a long maroon velvet dress. It had a moldy-looking lace frill on the collar and matching lace cuffs. There was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Weasley entered, carrying an armful of freshly laundered Hogwarts robes. Here you are, she said, sorting them into 2 piles. Now mind you pack them properly so they don't crease. Mum, you've given me Ginny's new dress, said Ron, handing it out to her. Of course I haven't, said Mrs. Weasley. That's for you. Dress robes. What? Said Ron, looking horror-struck. Dress robes, repeated Mrs. Weasley. It says on your school list that you're supposed to have dress robes this year. Robes for formal occasions. You've got to be kidding, said Ron in disbelief. I'm not wearing that. No way. Everyone wears them, Ron, said Mrs. Weasley crossly. They're all like that. Your father's got some for smart parties. They don't look like this. I'll go starkers before I put that on, said Ron stubbornly. Don't be so silly, said Mrs. Weasley. You've got to have dress robes. They're on your list. I got some for Harry, too. Show him, Harry. In some trepidation, Harry opened the last parcel on his camp bed. It wasn't as bad as he had expected. However, his dress robes didn't have any lace on them at all. In fact, they were more or less the same as the school ones, except that they were bottle green instead of black. I thought they'd bring out the color in your eyes, dear, said Mrs. Weasley fondly. Well, they're okay, said Ron angrily, looking at Harry's robes. Why couldn't I have some like that? Because, well, I had to get you a second hand, and there wasn't a lot of choice, said Mrs. Weasley, flushing. Harry looked away. Harry couldn't buy him... Help a dude out. Harry couldn't buy him better robes. Help a dude out. Harry looked away. He would willingly have split all the money. Split all the money in his Gringotts vault with the Weasleys, but he knew they would never take it. For Christmas, give him a new robe. Come on, this is terrible. I'm never wearing them, Ron was saying stubbornly. Never. Fine, snapped Mrs. Weasley. Go naked. And Harry, make sure you get a picture of him. Goodness knows I could do with a laugh. She left the room, slamming the door behind her. There was a funny spluttering noise from behind them. Pigwidgeon was choking on an overlarge owl treat. Why is everything I own rubbish? Said Ron furiously, striding across the room to unstick Pigwidgeon's beak. Oh, poor Ron. Ah. Oh, well. But that is the end of chapter 10. And that will be the end of the stream. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Please feel free to leave a comment on the video. I respond to those. Please like the stream. It's really helpful. It tells YouTube that you like it, and YouTube is more likely to share it with other people if you do. And if you're not a subscriber, click subscribe so you can get more content like this, and turn on notifications so you can be notified the next time I upload and the next time I go live. I'll be going live next week, Friday with more Plague's Tale, and Friday with more Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. And other things that I say. I was on a roll and then I lost it. Goblet of Fire. Oh, yes. If you want to know when I am streaming, follow me on Twitter, link in the description. Also in the description is my Patreon if you'd like to support me, or if you'd like to read my writing. If you can't afford to become a patron, there's free stuff on there as well, including a prologue for my new Harry Potter fanfiction. I also have a TikTok and an Instagram. You can find those in the description as well. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a magical evening. Bye-bye!